why Jasmine says Rick Scott's bill could collapse under its own consequences, and how citizens are now keeping evidence he can't protect ICE agents from. Because what she revealed about ICE abuses and the political cover-up turned a routine hearing into a legal warning shot Rick Scott never saw coming. Before we break down how Jasmine Crockett exposed the fatal flaws in Rick Scott's ICE immunity bill while simultaneously building a case that could bypass federal protection entirely, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because this story involves illegal detentions, evidence preservation, and the moment when protecting law enforcement became shielding criminals. The joint House-Senate hearing on immigration enforcement had already been tense for hours before Jasmine Crockett took the floor. Witness after witness had testified about ICE operations that went beyond aggressive enforcement into something darker. Citizens detained without cause, families torn apart based on appearance rather than legal status, a climate of fear that was affecting entire communities regardless of citizenship. Republican members kept insisting these were isolated incidents, operational mistakes that didn't reflect systematic problems. Democratic members kept presenting evidence suggesting otherwise. Then, Crockett spoke, and the entire framing of the conversation shifted. She didn't start with statistics or policy arguments. She started with a direct statement that made everyone in the room pay attention. I want to talk about Senator Rick Scott's proposed legislation to grant ICE agents immunity from what he calls lawfare, frivolous lawsuits designed to harass law enforcement. Because I've read his bill, I've studied the language, and I want everyone to understand what it actually does versus what Senator Scott claims it does. She held up a copy of the legislation, marked throughout with highlights and tabs. On the surface, this bill sounds reasonable, protecting law enforcement from baseless legal attacks. Who could object to that? But when you read the actual text, and I mean actually read it, not just the summary that gets presented to the public, you discover something disturbing. This bill would grant ICE agents blanket immunity from civil liability for actions taken in the course of immigration enforcement operations. That sounds specific, until you realize how broad immigration enforcement operations can be interpreted. Crockett flipped to a tabbed section. There's no requirement that the action be legal to qualify for immunity. There's no requirement that the agent have reasonable suspicion or probable cause. There's no exception for constitutional violations. Under Senator Scott's bill, an ICE agent could detain a U.S. citizen without any legal basis, violate their Fourth Amendment rights, cause emotional and financial harm, and face zero civil consequences because they were engaged in immigration enforcement operations. This isn't protecting law enforcement. This is creating a class of government agents who operate above the law. The Republican members immediately objected, arguing that Crockett was mischaracterizing the bill's intent. But she wasn't done establishing why the bill was both dangerous and ultimately futile. And here's what Senator Scott and his co-sponsors seem not to understand. Civil immunity doesn't prevent criminal prosecution. It doesn't prevent state-level charges. It doesn't prevent local prosecutors from bringing cases when federal agents violate state laws. All this bill does is close off one avenue of accountability, while assuming nobody will notice the others remain open. She let that sink in before making her point explicit. So when ICE agents detain U.S. citizens illegally, and we have documented cases of exactly that happening, and when those agents think they're protected by Senator Scott's immunity shield, they're going to be shocked when state attorneys general and local district attorneys start bringing criminal charges for false imprisonment, kidnapping, civil rights violations under state law. Federal immunity doesn't mean you're immune from state prosecution. And given what we're seeing in these operations, state prosecutors are going to be very interested in some of these cases. The room had gone very quiet. What Crockett was describing wasn't a hypothetical legal theory. It was a roadmap for accountability that Scott's bill had apparently failed to account for. Republican members were conferring with their legal staff, clearly trying to assess whether her interpretation was accurate. Democratic members looked energized, recognizing that she just outlined how to route around the federal immunity shield. But Crockett wasn't focused on the parliamentary maneuvering. She was focused on speaking directly to the people who'd been harmed by the abuses she was describing. I want to speak to anyone who's been illegally detained, anyone who's witnessed these operations, anyone who has evidence of ICE agents violating the law. This is critically important. Preserve everything. Save every document. Keep every photo and video. Maintain records of everything that happened. Dates, times, agent names if you have them, badge numbers, vehicle identification, everything. Because Senator Scott's immunity bill can't protect agents from evidence. And when prosecutors, whether federal, state, or local, eventually bring cases, that evidence is going to matter. The shift from legal analysis to direct address was powerful. She wasn't just making arguments to other members of Congress. She was issuing instructions to victims and witnesses, effectively mobilizing them to build cases that would survive whatever protections Republicans tried to implement. One of the witnesses who testified earlier, a U.S. citizen who'd been detained for 3 days despite showing documentation of citizenship, was visibly emotional, nodding along with Crockett's words. Then, Crockett did something unexpected. She pivoted from the technical legal discussion to the broader historical and moral context, and her language became more forceful. What we're witnessing isn't just aggressive immigration enforcement. It's a regime of fear that echoes some of the darkest periods in American history. The slave patrols that terrorized Black communities for generations operated on the same principle. Certain people don't have rights that need to be respected, so agents of the state can stop them, question them, detain them based purely on how they look. The comparison to slave patrols was provocative and intentional. Republican members immediately began objecting, calling it inflammatory and historically inaccurate. But Crockett stood her ground. I'm not saying ICE is exactly the same as slave patrols. I'm saying the functional dynamics are similar. When you empower government agents to stop people based on appearance, when you allow detention without adequate cause, when you create legal immunity for those agents regardless of whether they followed the law, you've recreated the essential elements of a patrol system, designed to control populations deemed suspect. History isn't repeating exactly, but it's rhyming. And we should be alarmed by that rhyme. She addressed the room with visible emotion now, her voice carrying weight beyond the legal arguments. I want to apologize on behalf of the United States government to every person who's been illegally detained, every family that's been torn apart without legal justification, every community that's living in fear because of these operations. You deserve better. The Constitution promises you better. And the fact that our government has failed you is shameful. The apology caught everyone off guard. Members of Congress don't typically apologize on behalf of the government during hearings. It's considered presumptuous, overstepping the authority of one representative. But Crockett clearly didn't care about the norm. She was speaking to victims directly, acknowledging harm directly, refusing to hide behind procedural language or political positioning. Several people in the gallery, witnesses and family members who'd been affected by ICE operations, were openly crying. Republican members tried to regain control by arguing that Crockett was turning the hearing into political theater rather than serious oversight. She responded by refocusing on the practical implications of Scott's bill and why it would ultimately fail to protect the agents it was designed to shield. Senator Scott thinks he can pass a law that makes accountability go away. But here's what he's missing. When you grant immunity without requiring legality, you incentivize abuse. You tell agents they can do whatever they want without consequences. And when that abuse becomes egregious enough, when citizens are being detained, when constitutional rights are being violated, you create a political environment where even protection from allies can't survive public scrutiny. She outlined the exact scenario that Scott's bill couldn't prevent. Let's say an ICE agent detains a U.S. citizen, holds them for days despite documentation proving citizenship, and causes significant harm in the process. Scott's bill says the victim can't sue the agent civilly. Fine. But the state where this happened can charge the agent with false imprisonment under state law. The local district attorney can bring charges. And when those criminal cases go to trial, all the evidence that's been preserved, the documentation, the testimony, the records comes out. Scott's immunity doesn't prevent that. It just means the accountability comes through a different door. The prediction was specific and damning. And here's what's going to make this worse for Senator Scott and anyone else who supports this bill. When those criminal trials happen, when evidence of abuse becomes public through state court proceedings, the political cost of having supported immunity for those agents becomes massive. You will have voted to protect people who are being convicted of violating Americans' rights. That's not a position any politician wants to defend during re-election. She was essentially warning that Scott's bill would create a political time bomb for its supporters. Grant immunity, Incentivize abuse. Watch that abuse get prosecuted at the state level. Face backlash for having protected the abusers. It was a logical chain that Scott's bill seemed not to have anticipated, and Crockett was making sure everyone understood the sequence. In a follow-up interview later that day on CNN, Crockett expanded on the arguments she'd made in the hearing, providing additional context that made her warnings even more pointed. The host asked about her controversial slave patrol comparison, giving her an opportunity to clarify or walk back. She did neither. When I said we're seeing a regime of fear that echoes slave patrols, I meant exactly that. We have documented cases of U.S. citizens with Latino heritage being detained because agents assumed their ethnicity meant questionable status. That's racial profiling. That's targeting people based on appearance. And when you grant immunity to agents engaging in that behavior, you're sanctioning a patrol system designed to control certain populations. That's not left versus right. That's right versus wrong. The interviewer pressed her on Rick Scott's bill specifically, asking whether she thought the senator intended to enable abuse or simply wanted to protect agents doing difficult jobs. Crockett's response was pointed. I don't particularly care about Senator Scott's intentions. I care about what his bill actually does. And what it does is create legal protection for unconstitutional conduct. Maybe he didn't intend that. Maybe he didn't read his own bill carefully enough. But the text is clear, and the consequences are predictable. You shield agents from accountability, you get more abuse. It's not complicated. She issued a warning that would become the most widely shared clip from the interview. Senator Scott and anyone else supporting this immunity bill need to understand something. You can't legislate away evidence. You can't pass a law that makes witnesses forget what they saw or victims forget what happened to them. You can try to block civil lawsuits, but you can't prevent criminal prosecution. You can try to shield federal agents, but you can't control what state prosecutors decide to charge. This bill is a temporary band-aid on a problem that requires actual reform. And when it fails, and it will fail, everyone who supported it is going to have to explain why they thought immunity was more important than accountability. Back in Washington, Rick Scott's office was dealing with the fallout from Crockett's very public dissection of his legislation. According to sources familiar with internal discussions, Scott's staff had assumed the immunity bill would be relatively uncontroversial among Republicans, framed as supporting law enforcement against activist lawsuits. They hadn't anticipated someone with Crockett's legal background systematically explaining why the bill wouldn't work and could actually make things worse for the agents it purported to protect. The legislative strategy shifted almost immediately. A clarifying amendment was drafted that attempted to address some of the concerns Crockett had raised, adding language about reasonable belief of legal authority and carve-outs for constitutional violations. But the damage was done. Democratic members who might have stayed quiet about the bill now had a comprehensive roadmap for attacking it. Civil liberties organizations that had been focused on other issues suddenly made defeating Scott's immunity bill a priority, and state attorneys general, particularly in states with progressive prosecutors, started publicly stating that they would indeed bring state charges against federal agents who violated state laws, regardless of federal immunity. Perhaps most significantly, Crockett's call for evidence preservation was being heeded. Immigrant rights organizations began distributing materials explaining how to document ICE encounters, what information to preserve, and how to ensure evidence would be available for future legal proceedings. It was grassroots legal preparation, creating a distributed network of documentation that no immunity bill could erase. A legal analyst specializing in immigration law told reporters that Crockett had identified the fundamental weakness in Scott's approach. Federal immunity from civil liability doesn't prevent state criminal prosecution. It's a basic principle of federalism. States have their own laws, their own prosecutors, their own courts. A federal law saying federal agents can't be sued doesn't prevent a state district attorney from bringing criminal charges under state law. Scott's bill is like building a wall on one side of a building while leaving the other three sides open. The analyst continued, what Crockett did was threaten to route accountability through state systems, which are often more responsive to local communities and local concerns. If ICE agents thought they were protected by federal immunity and then find themselves facing state criminal charges, the political and legal calculus changes dramatically. For Jasmine Crockett, the hearing and interview became another example of her approach. Identify the real-world impact of legislation explain it clearly enough that voters understand what's at stake, and outline specific strategies for resistance and accountability. She wasn't just opposing Scott's bill, she was explaining why it would fail and what people should do to ensure that failure. In a closing statement during the hearing that wouldn't make most news coverage, but that resonated deeply with the people in the room who'd been directly affected, Crockett spoke directly to victims and witnesses one more time. You are the light they're afraid of. Your stories, your evidence, your willingness to come forward despite fear. That's what accountability requires. Senator Scott's bill is designed to make you feel like speaking up doesn't matter. Like even when abuse happens, there won't be consequences. But I'm telling you, preserve your evidence, tell your stories, and watch what happens when prosecutors who care about justice get their hands on what you've documented. Federal immunity doesn't mean impunity. And the agents who cross the line are about to learn that. The message was empowerment disguised as legal analysis. She was telling victims they had power that legislation couldn't take away, that documentation couldn't be legislated out of existence, that accountability would find its way through whatever doors remained open, even if some were closed. It was both a promise and a strategy, and it resonated because it came from someone who understood both the legal mechanisms and the human cost of the abuses being discussed. Rick Scott's immunity bill would continue through the legislative process, picking up Republican support as a show of solidarity with immigration enforcement and Trump's broader agenda, but it would carry with it the stigma Crockett had attached. This was a bill designed to shield abuse, promoted by politicians who cared more about protecting agents than protecting citizens' rights. And when, not if, but when, cases emerged of agents hiding behind that immunity after violating Americans' constitutional rights, every supporter would have to answer for it. For Scott specifically, representing Florida with its significant Latino population, including many U.S. citizens, the political calculation was becoming more complicated. Crockett had made sure that everyone understood his immunity bill would protect agents who detained citizens based on ethnic appearance. That wasn't a sustainable position for a senator from a diverse state, and the political pressure was beginning to show. The question wasn't whether Scott's bill would pass. With Republican control, it probably would in some form. The question was what would happen after, when the consequences Crockett had predicted started materializing, when state prosecutors started bringing cases, when evidence that had been carefully preserved started appearing in court proceedings. She'd issued a warning disguised